I'm Lesley Riddoch. I'm a columnist with The National, an independent supporter, a journalist, and I'm very chuffed to be interviewing the three leaders of the pro-independence parties in Scotland before the general election. Just to say that the point of these interviews is to help let voters probably, given that it's The National, pro-independence voters make up their minds between these parties. So I'll be pressing them. I'm trying not to ask patsy questions, habit of a lifetime, so I hope nobody takes this personally. And there will be questions that have been supplied by readers that will get chucked in. So anyway, I'm delighted to be joined now by Lorna Slater, who is the co-leader of the Scottish Greens. Hello, Lorna.
Hi, Lesley. It's lovely to see you again.
So it looks as if it's a dead cert that Labour are going to win this general election. What will that mean for Scotland?
It does indeed look like Labour will take the most seats at Westminster. And what it means for Scotland is kind of the big question here. I was reading in the Financial Times this morning about Labour's plans for economically speaking. And what they're saying is that they are trivial. They are nothing like enough money to end austerity, to properly invest in the NHS, to properly tackle the climate crisis, that essentially we're looking at more austerity. So I think that is what it means for Scotland economically, is that we are tied into this Westminster system of austerity forever, because that wasn't just a Tory thing. That's a Westminster thing. That's how they think the country should be run. But in terms of Scotland and how Scotland looks in this general election, I think it's kind of all to play for. Unlike in past elections where it always seemed a bit of a done deal, the question is up in the air and polls are flipping one way or the other. Will we retain a pro-independence majority of seats in Scotland, or will Labour, win here also? And I think that isn't at all clear.
But when you say a pro-independence majority, to be blunt, it's an SNP majority, because first past the post means the wee parties just don't get a look in. Will you feel regret if you're standing, I think you're standing in 44 seats, if your standing actually edges out an SNP candidate and leads to that loss at Scottish level to Labour?
It's an interesting question, and one we get asked all the time. And the answer is no. Independence doesn't belong to just one party. And the question is how far up everybody's agenda independence is in this election, because there have been pro-independence majorities at Westminster and indeed at Holyrood over and over and over again. And that hasn't led either the Tories or the Labour Party to recognise Scotland's democratic right to hold another referendum. So this is the frustration. I don't think sending a pro-independence majority to Westminster this time would change that arithmetic. But what we do need to do in Scotland is have a broader range of support for independence. The independence movement is maturing. We're solidly polling at about half of people in Scotland, but we need to break through that half. We need to be able to put pressure on the unionist parties such that they look at what they're offering and see that they cannot win if they're only speaking to people who are pro-union. And that, I think, is where there's an interesting pressure point building in Scotland, because we know that about half people in Scotland are in favour of independence. But if many of those people end up voting Labour in this election, then that's going to put pressure on Labour to change their stance from this solidly pro-unionist one, or they're going to start losing their voters.
So is that meaning that a vote for Labour is a good thing in this Scottish election, in this general election?
In Scotland, of course, it is absolutely up to everyone how they want to vote. And I want people to vote Scottish Greens, because a vote for the Scottish Greens is not only a vote for independence, it's a vote for that honesty about what investment we're going to need in not only Scotland, but in the UK to make this just transition away from oil and gas and to deal with the NHS and our public services. So I want you to vote Scottish Greens, of course.
Sure, of course you do. But if you were to say to people, is there really nothing much between the SNP and Labour? Do you really not want the SNP to be winning these seats?
The SNP's fortunes are really for the SNP to look after. As a leader of a party who is standing against the SNP, you would expect me to say that.
No, but I was picking up on what you said, where actually if independence voters do end up voting Labour, they will carry their attitudes with them and begin to knock Labour back towards an acceptance that there's a democratic thing to do here called an independence referendum. That sounds a wee bit like saying it actually could be quite good if people who support independence do lend Labour their vote this time.
It's an interesting question, Lesley, as to what the future of the independence movement looks like. Does it look like a resurgence of the SNP? Does it look like the growth of the Scottish Greens? Or does it look like switching another party over to independence, softening that stance of the unionists? I don't think that independence belongs to any one party. I think Scottish independence is such an important thing. It's going to be so, make such a difference to the future of the people of Scotland that it doesn't belong to any one party. We all own the future of Scottish independence. So the crucial thing, of course, is making sure that there is that majority groundswell for independence in Scotland. And the interesting question there is, how do we develop that? How do we push support from independence from 50% closer to 60%? And how do we express that best at the ballot box? If that is people's number one concern, what do they tick in the ballot box to make sure that that is the case? Of course, for the Scottish Greens, the climate and independence go hand in hand, because we don't think that the Westminster system works for looking after our climate, for investing in those new green economies that we desperately need and that we have such big opportunities for in Scotland.
Now, I mean, you did come out in one of the TV debates with independence very, very quickly. And yet when I look at your manifesto, it isn't mentioned until something like page 38. I mean, this is what my mother would have said is all gong and no dinner. Of course, that comment you made before about being willing to work with Labour kind of frightened a lot of people and just made them uncertain about your real priorities. The comments you've made there, I mean, I understand what you're saying about needing to widen the thing out, but it will begin to sound like you're getting ready to work with Labour in Holyrood.
Well, that's a really interesting question as well, Lesley. And the Scottish Greens are clearly an independent supporting party. We're part of the Green. Yes, we've been solidly pro-independence. As you say, we see it as part of how we're going to tackle the climate crisis, how we're going to get away from this broken Westminster system, some of the things that are very core Green values, creating that more compassionate economy, getting rid of nuclear weapons. Things that are absolutely core Green are tied to the independence movement. The arithmetic of the next Holyrood election is going to be interesting, because if the SNP, the SNP might well be able to achieve enough seats to get a government, to form a government again, but they might not. And if Labour said, yes, we're going to put in place rent controls, yes, we're going to invest in the climate, of course, we would be interested in doing those things. We're not going to say, no, we're not going to tackle child poverty. Yes, of course, we're going to tackle child poverty, because those are also things that the Greens are interested in. And this is something
like a scenario, or the kind of agreement that you had if it came to the bit, like the Bute House agreement with Labour?
It's very hard to kind of anticipate what might happen. The Bute House agreement was based on long years of trust building between the SNP and the Greens, because the Greens had supported SNP budgets in the past and worked together very closely. Of course, we don't have any sort of relationship of that kind with Labour. So it is hard to imagine something like that emerging. But, we just don't know what the next 2 years are going to look like. I think that we're going to have a big opportunity in 2026 to have a substantial conversation about independence. Labour are going into this general election confident of a win, but without actually promising to change anything substantial. So we're going to have 2 years of people expecting and hoping change, and then being failed and disappointed that no change has happened. So going into the next Holyrood election, we will be able to make the case very strongly that it is Westminster that's the problem and not any particular party.
So would you support, as a strategy, what ALBA are calling for, which is to have essentially a de facto referendum at the Holyrood election?
At the Holyrood election, we are going to be in 2026, so 4 years away from 2030, which is a crucial date for climate, which means that those final years as we approach 2030 are going to be make or break for whether we hit our climate targets in 2045. So there's absolutely no way that the Scottish Greens are going to give up on our campaigning around climate. We believe that the climate presents an existential threat to the people of Scotland and the world, and that nothing can be more important than ensuring that future generations can continue to live and thrive and grow crops on planet Earth. So of course we're going to continue to talk about all issues that matter to us, including independence. And there doesn't have to be this either or. Independence is the means by which we can deliver on all these good things that any small independent European country can deliver, but the UK is unable to, because the UK is such a broken democracy.
Let me ask a question from a national reader, Jim Savage, who says, can you put egos and entrenched attitudes aside to work with the other parties to gain independence? Now, the Greens, quite famously, will not really share a platform with ALBA because of their views about gender. Isn't that really a big problem for trying to talk about a movement when there's that big wedge right in the middle of it?
The Scottish Greens are a values-based party. And of course, we have just spent 3 years in government working very, very closely with the SNP, forming a government together, finding those bits of common ground. And I think we have shown that a pro-independence government can work well, that we can form stable government, although of course that collapsed more recently, that there is the opportunity for forming that pro-independence majority in Holyrood.
But I'm talking about ALBA just
yeah,
here.
Absolutely. So it is a challenge, of course, because we are a values-based party. We're not always comfortable sharing a platform with people, with organizations that do not share our values. And that's important to our members. And it is important to how we see the Greens. We are pushing forward. And, our mission, I guess the 4 pillars of the Green movement are peace, that's nonviolence; equality, that's really important to us; radical local democracy; and of course, sustainability, that's the environmental bit. Now, all 4 of those pillars of the Green movement are equally important to us. Human rights are just as important as the environment to us, and that will always be the case. That radical local democracy is just as important to us, which is why we will continue to work for Scottish independence. And asking us to step away from our values-based platform to be a single issue party isn't who the Scottish Greens are.
That's not still the point. It's more that how can there be a movement where there is one issue that's not about independence that sits in the middle and means the Scottish Greens can't share a platform with folk from another party who think differently? And I mean, I'm sorry to give you a double-loaded question, but this is not just people from the outside lobbing in about the Scottish Greens stance. I mean, you have recently had to lose some members, 13 members, I think, for signing a statement that sex is a biological reality. I mean, it looks, from the outside, I've got to say, it looks kind of quite Stalinist.
The Scottish Green, I'm very happy to get into this, Lesley, because it's a really good conversation to have. Scottish Green policy and the stance we take on certain issues are set by our members. So that is elected at conference every year. And as party leader, what I really am is a spokesperson for the party. Patrick and I don't sit in a dark room and cook up party policy and inflict it on our members. That is absolutely not how it works. These positions come from our membership. Now, I am actually really delighted that our members do have the stances that we do: strong on climate, strong on independence, and strong on equalities. I absolutely support these stances. I couldn't be spokesperson for an organization where I didn't support these stances.
But the difficulty can be that actually, for example, I saw Professor Richard Murphy was interviewing the 3 economic spokespeople for the 3 parties, and Ross Greer made some very interesting points, including a wealth tax, which I will be putting to Stephen Flynn. But that's not how the public are picking you up, because questions about whether or not the Cass report is being accepted by your leadership are actually much more out there. Your stance essentially on gender rights has eclipsed almost your stance on the climate.
I would disagree with that, Lesley. It's something I actually don't get asked about that often. I've done any number of media over the last few weeks because of the general election, and it isn't something that people are widely exercised about. We did get a lot of questions on our wealth tax, on visibility in terms of where we are on climate. Oil and gas, of course, has been really, really big. there are a small number of people that are very exercised around trans rights. But the Scottish Greens stance on that has always been really, really clear. We are absolutely in favor of human rights, and we're not going to sacrifice the rights of a minority just to make the issue go away. We are here to press for and campaign for continued increase of civil rights to make sure that everybody's rights are respected. And I am absolutely proud of that. And I think that this is something that the Scottish Greens can be proud of, that we have been absolutely rock solid in support for trans people, in support for LGBTQ plus people, and that we will continue to be, because that is so core to who we are. Human rights are for everybody.
Okay, so you're beginning to look at your record in a sense, as a kind of partner in government. How do you feel about looking back at the Green policies that you've tried to push forward? Because it looks like a lot of them have kind of bitten the dust.
Do you mean with the Bute House Agreement?
Yeah, whether it was, the HPMAs or the bottle deposit return scheme.
That's so interesting that you framed those like that, and that is how it's framed in the media. So HPMAs and the highly protected marine areas or increased marine protections were actually in every single party's manifesto. That was not a uniquely green thing. And the deposit return scheme, as you'll recall, was passed by the last term of Parliament. But this is what's so interesting, is that these were not policies that were uniquely brought by the Greens, but we've seen this strange polarization happen in politics where, although things like the deposit return scheme was supported by Parliament through a super affirmative procedure, it was widely supported because it was led by me. It was then boiled down to as if it was some green policy. Boris Johnson had a deposit return scheme with glass in his manifesto. So these were policies that actually had a broad cross-party consensus on. And then suddenly, when Greens are in power, everybody else, decided to back away from these things. And so they became what had not been controversial 5 years ago. Suddenly, people were acting as if these were controversial things. A bottle return scheme of all things, to improve recycling was suddenly this wild controversial thing. And the parties who stepped away from their environmental credentials did so because they felt there was some sort of political advantage to that.
Yeah, but our time, Lorna, just what I'm asking is, have you taken the public with you? I mean, let's just look at the HPMAs. I know a lot of folk on islands, a lot of people who are very keen on marine conservation and who deeply resented a consultation that basically said, we'd like to designate part of your waters as a no-take zone. We're not going to tell you quite where it is, and you won't get any compensation. What do you think about that? I mean, how are you ever going? That's so top down, and it seems counter to all the grassroots stuff that the Greens are meant to be about. How did you let that one slip past? Because that put backs up everywhere.
Yeah, that's so interesting, Lesley. We can definitely learn some lessons from that. So that wasn't at all intended to be a top-down thing. What that was intended to be was a high-level consultation in terms of asking those questions. Because I think the challenge is if you go in with too much detail up front, like, for example, if we had drawn lines on a map or anything like that, people would have said, you're inflicting this up. But this is instead, we said at the highest level.
For themselves. That's how the no-take zone was established at Lamlash Bay on Arran, was that the guys just sat down with the fishermen and came up with a plan.
Brilliant. And that is an excellent example of how that worked. So I think that's something that with the HPMAs, the intention was to just ask those very high level questions to understand what people's feelings were. And then if there were areas that were keen, to be able to move forward with those. Unfortunately, that isn't how it was interpreted. So you're right. We got that wrong in terms of how we asked that question. Okay. So that is something that is going to have to be revisited.
But that sort of really matters because it looks like, across Europe at the moment, and it varies, but quite a lot of governments that have been pushing the green transition have found they've been pushed back. For example, if we look at the Heat and Buildings bill that's coming through, hopefully, in the Scottish Government, you're involved in framing that. We're looking at a transition to green heating, which is really needed. And yet, what it'll mean is a lot of expenditure for householders on trying to turn towards heat pumps by the looks of it. Will that be another point where you get a lot of pushback? And again, since you're the Green Party, it may be pushed back against you, even if you're not formally in coalition to deliver it.
That is something that we're, definitely have to figure out how to move forward on, because it is something that is needed for emissions reduction, as you rightly say, and it is something that will benefit, Scotland as a whole, to make sure that we've got properly insulated homes that are warm, that people can afford to heat. The costs to the NHS and to people's well-being from cold, damp homes is substantial. So we do need to make progress on that. So figuring out how to fund and finance these things is absolutely the challenge. The challenge at the moment, actually, is that the Scottish government has reasonable sums of money for this, which aren't being taken up. So it isn't so much that the money isn't there, it's that we're having difficulty delivering it across the country because not enough people know how to do the installations, not enough people know the money's available. So there is something about ramping that up, and it isn't all just about the matter of cost, because there's more money available at the moment than is being taken up. But it is a conversation that we have to have. And around the world, you're quite right. How do we move forward with this transition where it's going to cost? And this brings us back to the kind of larger manifesto questions of what the major Westminster parties are promising versus what they have actually costed.
Yeah, really not. We're coming right there, right? But just while we're on still the heat thing, I mean, okay, everyone will know that this is a question I keep going on about, but it's because looking at all the Nordic countries, they all have district heating. They don't leave people to sink and swim with individual heat pumps, which will have to be individually replaced in 25 years. So what is the reason that when I ask about heating buildings, we end up talking about heat pumps and not about big systematic district heating that takes that individual burden off people by a state-sponsored function?
I don't disagree, Lesley, at all. I don't know what the kind of how the plan fits together in terms of joining that up, but we absolutely do have to have district heating. For example, here I live in a tenement flat, so I'm not going to be able to install a heat pump for myself. It will have to be in these sorts of tenements. It will have to be done by district heating. Right. We know that, and that's always been part of the plan.
If you guys aren't talking about that, for, absolute front, center, and whatever, who will? Because I'm not hearing that. And a third of Scotland lives in tenemental property. Yeah. So that's a lot of people that need to get a government sorted out, or, government private sector set of systems urgently before they can do a green transition. And the Heat and Buildings Bill will put a time, it's ticking along, where you actually have to have made that transition.
But the Heat and Buildings Bill, it does have something different in it for tenements. It isn't expecting people in tenements to put in place their own heat pump. That wouldn't make sense. District heating has always been part of the plan for tenements. And I know Patrick Harvey has spoken about that. It's one of those things that if we're not getting the message out there, then we absolutely do need to, because you're right. For people who live in tenemented properties like myself, it's got to be done as a district thing, as a community thing. And it's got to be, that's a major public infrastructure undertaking, as you suggest. So that is absolutely going to have to be the way that's going to be.
It's just that people sometimes might say that there's a little bit of an unworldliness about the Greens sometimes, in that if you think that something makes sense on paper and it saves the world and adds up, you don't seem to notice that there are the interests of people in the middle of it, which will always govern the reaction most strongly. I mean, for example, with the recycling, the Scottish government is being sued by the recycling firm Biffa for compensation over that, which could be really quite considerable. And that will have put people's backs up for quite a long time. I hear your point, because the SNP actually began quite a lot of that recycling stuff. You took it over. But still, there seems to be a sort of a lack of understanding how people would react if it's going to cost them a lot of money.
So the deposit return scheme, another one I'm very happy to get into in detail, 71% of people in Scotland did support that. So that was a project that was widely supported by people. And we were at the point we were weeks away from launching that. We had substantially more than 90% of the drinks market by volume of materials lined up in that scheme. They were signed up to it. So we were weeks away from launch. So the challenges there were political ones. That was interference by Alistair Jack at the last possible minute with that scheme for reasons that he never explained. And he was invited to Holyrood committees on 2 occasions by Edward Mountain of the NZEC committee, and refused to come along to explain why he chose to block our scheme. So that's obviously something that's, there will be that court case around that. So I probably can't say any more than what I've just said, which is already in the public domain.
Let me put this to you.
But it wasn't a matter of not the people coming along with that one. That one was had broad public support. As I say, 71% of people in Scotland were in support for that scheme. So it isn't necessarily that the public aren't on board, because I think for a lot of this stuff, the public are on board. there are challenges in some spaces. How do we pay for things like the transition in terms of our homes? How do we talk with rural and island communities about the benefits of no-take zones? Because as you say, in some places, people have sat down and created them. In New Zealand, it was the fishers that came to the government and said, that we need these no-take zones to act as nurseries to keep our industry sustainable. Please set them up. So it's helping work with people to understand the benefits to them, because I think that these policies are more popular than the press would have us believe, because I think the public do get it. We know that high numbers of people are concerned about the climate crisis and about the impact, but they constantly get this kind of misinformation that it's got to be rural concerns or the environment, or workers' concerns or the environment. But actually, all of these things go together. Okay. Investing in rural communities is an excellent way to tackle the climate crisis, and we all need to build towards a sustainable future.
And yet, okay, so there's your 71% of people who, at one point anyway, were totally fine with the idea of deposit return, and probably still are. And yet, the last opinion poll for the Scottish Greens showed you polling just 6%. And actually, worryingly, that's less than Reform in Scotland.
So that's for the general election. For the
general election. I know we've drifted, and it's interesting actually how much the smaller parties are looking for an almost dress rehearsal, for Holyrood. It does still make a lot of people wonder, if that's all you're interested in doing, why are you queering the pitch for the party that could win? But still, let's park that for a minute. Why are you polling so low?
Because it is a general election. It is a first past the post election, and the electorate know how these things work. They know that first past the post elections are essentially rigged for the bigger parties, and that is a challenge. But I think it's not wrong to frame the general election for us as a way of getting ready for Holyrood. And our last Holyrood poll is very good. I think we were on 14 MSPs, so looking to double our numbers. So where we have that proportional, more democratic voting, where people know they can vote with their values and what they really want, they're confident to vote Scottish Greens. But where we have this first past the post, you've heard me say it a million times, this sort of broken Westminster democracy, where people have to, what they're trying to do is figure out how to game the system, where their vote's actually going to matter. And it means that they're not voting with their values. And that is frustrating to all of us, to be trapped in this union with its broken democracy. But it's also frustrating for small parties, because it's not just the matter of first past the post. There's all the other pieces that go along with that, like the deposits-based system for putting up candidates, which absolutely hammers us in terms of how many candidates we can stand versus the larger parties who stand even more candidates but come out of the elections kind of with net positive money. So we do very, very well with the resources and in the system that we have. But yes, absolutely, this is for us a work towards Holyrood and toward those council elections in 2027, where we can get people elected because of that more democratic system.
Energy. There seems to be a new situation potentially after the ruling by the Supreme Court just last week on a drilling proposal in Surrey, which decided that the entire use of the oil or gas has to be counted into its viability, not just the way that you would extract it. Do you think that means that the big fields that have already been licensed, like Rosebank, are now stuck? Could there be more court cases taken by Greenpeace, for example?
I absolutely hope so. That was the first bit of good climate news I've had in a long time. It's absolutely ridiculous that when so-called climate compatibility assessments of oil fields and so forth have been done in the past, that they didn't actually consider the emissions of the oil that was being extracted. That's absolutely bizarre. So this is absolutely how it should be. When you're looking at putting in place an oil well or some sort of plant to bring up the gas, then you need to look at the entire emissions of what's being created, because all of those emissions end up in our atmosphere, and all of them are leading to this potentially catastrophic global heating. Let's make sure that we're keeping the context right here. The Secretary General of the UN says we're on the road to climate hell if we don't get a hold of our emissions, and that's within the next 5 years. So I don't think that Rosebank or any of those new oil fields were ever compatible with keeping our obligations to try and keep global temperature rise to 1.5 degrees or below. They never were, but now they're going to be forced to admit that they're not.
So where do you think that leaves the SNP with its climate compatibility test on each new project?
Well, it was always a load of rubbish, if you ask me, because we worked together on that energy strategy, and we know perfectly well that we don't need that oil and gas. There is that draft energy strategy shows exactly how we transition to 100% renewables. We don't need nuclear. We can finish working the basins that we've got. That will keep people in that industry in work for years to come. That, as those basins are worked out, and we build up these new massive industries. Offshore wind, we've already, ScotWind is one of the largest offshore wind projects in the world. We are coming online with green hydrogen that has enormous potential. All of these things we know we can make work because that's what's in the energy strategy. This somehow the SNP are trying to go, oh, but if climate compatible, they know perfectly well that those climate compatibility tests will show they're not climate compatible. We already know that. Okay. But they're saying that as a way to try and walk the line that they're not annoying their supposed voters in the Northeast, but also not annoying people who care about the environment. It's a dishonest stance.
When you were in partnership with the SNP and the Bute House Agreement, you did get to a stage where you decided to basically drop the carbon emissions cut target by 2030. I mean, you agreed you were nowhere near getting it, so it was worth it. The only thing to do was to drop it. Was that a good decision, and why, even with your involvement, was it so wide of the mark?
Well, in order to hit those climate targets, it would have been necessary to start making changes decades ago. And the kind of changes that the Scottish Greens were pushing for at the time, we have to put in place what they call demand management for roads, but that really means charging people to use roads, because you have to start making it cheaper to take public transport, and you have to put in place better public transport, but you need money to invest in that. So you have to create this virtuous cycle of making it a little bit more expensive to use the roads, and cars and things like the workplace parking levy will help with that. And using that money to invest in better public transport, so then more people will take buses and trains, and you create this virtuous circle. And that kind of thing needed to be done decades ago. We had a very interesting meeting when Humza Yousaf was First Minister, where he brought Chris Stark from the Climate Change Committee in to meet the party leaders. So Douglas Ross, Anna Sarwar, Alex Coe-Hamilton, myself and Patrick were all there. And he laid it out flatly, facts on the table, non-political. Scotland's done quite well at its energy transition. We've moved away from coal. We've gone to largely renewable energy. But we've done poorly on our land transition, we've done poorly on our industrial transition, and we've done poorly on our transport. Now, we needed to start looking at how we manage our land, how we change our transport, and how we decarbonize our industries decades ago. You can't turn that stuff around on a dime. Now, with Scottish Greens in government, we were starting to make some substantial changes. The Heat and Buildings Bill, which you've already spoken about, was a really good example of that. We've got the Agriculture Reform which has now passed, which allows us to put in place tools to start changing that land use. And I know you're very involved in the land reform movement as well. So all of these things would have started moving in that direction, having honest conversations about Grangemouth and some of our really big industrial sites that need decarbonizing. But that wasn't done. And that 3 years we were in government has, it's enough to change the dial, but not enough to make up for decades of inaction. Okay. So there is a question about how long do you keep a target there, which has been used for a lot of, if you pardon the phrase, virtue signaling, going, oh, well, aren't we great? We've got ambitious targets, without actually admitting that you've done nothing to try and achieve them, nothing realistic. And so there is a bit of coming clean there and saying, look, the Scottish government and the UK government for decades haven't done enough to hit those targets. Is it honest to keep that target there and keep pointing at it going, oh, we have world-leading targets, when you're actually not taking the action? So I think that was a good conversation to have, but it is a really, really difficult one, and was very difficult for the members of our party in particular.
I wonder, though, I mean, there you're saying that Humza Yousaf actually invited Chris Stark in, which was something in your eyes. That was kind of quite a move, and yet you know a lot of people will feel that that you let them down, that you betrayed his trust. Just over what? The way that he ended an agreement that looks like it was always going to be ended prior to the election for all sorts of reasons. Do you have any regrets about that period?
I think the whole period was a bit of a shame in terms of, I think Hamza was in a difficult position, but I think he made a poor choice. I can understand the parliamentary arithmetic is brutal. He had 7 Green votes, which he had to balance off against however many, and I don't know how many backbencher rebels he had that he couldn't keep in line. So clearly that was more than 7, and he felt that wasn't sustainable. Now, our party members were very challenged by this discussion around the targets and around the Bute House Agreement in general. Things like the council tax freeze were very, very unpopular with our councillors and our members as well. So they wanted a chance to revisit that agreement. Now, I think that we would have come through that with our membership in support. Maybe not, because originally the Bute House Agreement had 85% support of our membership. It may not have come through that strongly, but I think our members would have supported it, because I think that it's clear that with Greens in government, we were able to do things like get that presumption against new oil and gas into the energy strategy. We were able to put in place quite an ambitious buildings bill and so on. So I think our members would have supported that. So I think the deal,
with an election coming up, as you've said yourself, maybe it's with an eye to the northeast. Maybe there's a pulling back on oil and gas, or fuzzing it up at least. That was always going to happen. Is there any way that ending of the Bute House Agreement could have been done in such a way that you were not prepared to vote in a vote of no confidence against an independent supporting party?
The challenge is, Lesley, is that the Bute House Agreement was a confidence and supply agreement. And we were already under pressure from our members saying we're not getting enough from the Bute House Agreement. So Hamza Yusuf unilaterally, without having a discussion with us on this, ended the Bute House Agreement. So he ended an agreement in which he got our votes of confidence and our support for the budget in exchange for all that stuff, all that Bute House stuff, which our members were already saying maybe that's not quite enough. We're not seeing the move on.
I think we've all had those arguments. What I'm asking, I suppose, is was there any way he could have done it? You're saying if he'd spoken to you, it might have been okay to dump the agreement?
No, I think if he'd spoken to us, we could have come to a way to keep the agreement going, because I think the agreement did have legs. And I think Hamza Yusuf is a really good person. I think his values are solid. I think his vision for Scotland was excellent. But by caving into his more reactionary backbenchers, who didn't share our progressive vision for Scotland, and I understand why he needs to do that to keep his party together, he pushed us out. And he can't expect you can't sort of push us out and say we're not interested in hearing your views, but I still want your votes. That's just not how this works. So if you want Green votes, if you want Green support, then we need something in exchange for that. And he was sort of saying, we're not going to give you anything in exchange, but I still expect your support. That's not a reasonable political position. So It is a shame how all that fell out. I think we could have made the deal go the distance. But these are difficult political times. The arithmetic next time around will be different. I'm very much hoping, and we're polling to have a significant larger number of Greens. If that helps make a progressive pro-independence majority in Parliament, in Scottish Parliament, more stable, that might have legs to run again. And I'd be interested in having that conversation.
Right, some rapid fire questions at the end that I'm asking all both the other two leaders. First one, did that defeat last night in the Euros for Scotland, will that have any kind of impact on the election campaign?
Oh, I think it's disheartened everyone. It was such a good feeling of energy going into it. So yeah, I think it might dampen people's enthusiasm a bit, but we'll recover and we'll come back. I know it.
Were you watching?
No, sadly, I was not watching. I did see bits of some of the earlier games.
Right. The Portillo moment that many of us are old enough to remember from previous elections, it looks like a lot of the big beasts of the Tory party are already vacating the space. Is there anyone particularly that you're sitting thinking, it would be quite good to see them on the platform having to concede that they've lost?
I think, fortunately or unfortunately, the people who cause me most challenge are in post are not standing again. So Alistair Jack, obviously, we had some very difficult discussions around deposit return scheme, but as I understand, he's not standing again. So that will save him from that moment.
Right. And finally, what is your biggest political mistake?
My biggest political mistake? Oh, goodness me. That's an interesting question. Biggest political mistake? I think not realizing that I was in an electable position. So if you'll recall back in the dim and distant, Lesley, I was selected by my party to be third on the Lothian list. So I understood that I was safely unelectable because, of course, at that time we had 2 Lothian MSPs. So I went off during the pandemic to Germany, and I was working on building turbines there. And I got a call from Ross Greer on December 12th of 2020 saying, one of our MSPs is left, you're in. So I had to come back and prepare myself to be in the national debate and to be elected in a very short period of time, when if I had realized I was going to be electable, I maybe would have spent more time during the pandemic preparing and getting to know how Parliament worked rather than building turbines.
Right. Okay. Well, that's very honest, all the answers there. Thank you so much for your time, and good luck in the rest of this campaign, Lorna Slater.
Thank you so much, Lesley.